have been coming to the Middle Conference since it began. So this is my 8th time here. And the theme that Jackie mentioned, a different version of that you heard earlier today, but a theme that has always resonated with me, is that leaders tell compelling stories that challenge the dominant narrative. And we know in our society we have dominant narratives about race, about class, about gender, about many issues that affect justice, equity, equality in this country and around the world. And there are some stories that we as Multicultural Growth and Witness are seeking to counter by the work that we do. There are stories that this panel has come together to help us counter those narratives. So let me say a little bit about what those are. First of all, I have been in conversations with people, and one of the things I've been hearing is that, and this is based on folks who also look at official research, so not just anecdotes, but that white male voices are increasingly absent from the conversations that we're having about multiculturalism, and also absent from social justice movements. White males are generally least likely to participate in social justice movements, service learning, and so we feel that it's really important to have modeling of people who are countering that narrative by their participation in social movements and in ministries of social justice. Another is that often when people say diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism, they don't think of white people, period, and they don't think of white males, right? But if we're talking about inclusion, it means everybody, every identity, every person is included in that. The word, when we say multicultural, it means everyone. And if white men are less in that conversation, that means we're not hearing how their participation is impacting their lives, how they're being transformed, what they're learning, what they bring to the conversation. And it's really important that we begin to pay attention to the roles that white men and white people must play in terms of bringing about the vision of the multicultural beloved community. Otherwise, what's happening is that let's see, I had this better in my mind earlier. What's happening is that people think that the work of anti-racism is only people of color, the work of people of color, and that cannot be. This transformation cannot happen without the participation of white people or white identified people. And then there's also what kind of modeling do we see for white people who are participating in social justice and in anti-racism work and multicultural ministry. And we need the modeling of people who know how to step back, who understand what their identities mean, who know how to model following the leadership of people of color, who model vulnerability as well as strength, and who understand that their power doesn't just come from, oh, we're very talented, smart, creative people, which all of these ministers are here, but also that there's a system, there's a culture, there's institutional power that also reinforces their position as leaders. And that if Unitarian Universalism, for those of us in the room who are Unitarian Universalists, but I think this applies to every religious group, if we're going to transform into a truly multicultural faith community, we cannot wait until there are people of color, okay, when we get to the 10%, the 20%, the 30%, then we can participate in this transformation. No, we can't wait. It's not so much the browning of the pews. It's not who is sitting in the pews. It is how are our congregations engaging in the larger community and in the struggles of people who are striving for a more just world? So this is why this panel, here you have 4 leaders who have been engaged in varying contexts and who've entered varying portals into anti-racism work, whose ministries are grounded in justice making, because we also understand you cannot create that multicultural beloved community and not engage in the justice struggles of the people you're trying to build that human family with. And if you want to be effective in social justice work, you have to do it in a multicultural context. We cannot afford these barriers and these borders that have kept us apart for so long. So it's a both-and proposition. And Jackie quoted the prophet India Ari. I want to quote the prophet Dolly Parton, who said, "Honey, if you want the rainbow, you got to put up with the rain." All right? So today we have, and I will call out their names as they appear on the panel. First, we have the Reverend Marlin Lavanhar, who's the senior minister of All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Next to him, we have the Reverend Dr. Fred Muir, senior minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Annapolis, Maryland. Seated next to Fred, we have the Reverend Joshua Mason Pawelek, who's parish minister at the Unitarian Universalist Society in East Manchester, Connecticut. Senior and junior. All right. Multitasking. And next to Josh, we have the Reverend Robert M. Hardies, Reverend Dr. Robert M. Hardies, who's the senior minister at All Souls Church Unitarian in Washington, D.C. And I want to thank our panelists for challenging that narrative through your ministries. And let's hear from our challengers. So they have coordinated their conversation. We have given them some reflection questions, and they have decided how they will share their learning, their stories with you.
So it's an honor to be among you, and it's really wonderful to be here. I went to seminary just across the island on the Upper West Side, Union, and never. I did my field work placement down here when it maybe wasn't as nice to walk around as it is now. This is back in the '70s. It was kind of a dangerous territory, and it's nice to come back again. How many of you have been to Annapolis? Does anybody here? Oh, a whole bunch of you. When I went to Annapolis as the call to minister to a congregation of about 150 members, about 20, 30 kids in the church school, I was 33 years old. And when I got there, I wondered, what on earth am I doing here? The first 5 years were very, very painful. My wife and I would go out for drives trying to plot how we were going to get out of the city of Annapolis and do it somewhat gracefully, as well as still having opportunities to serve another congregation. And the problem was I had never been to a place like Annapolis. It's the home since 1845 of the U.S. Naval Academy. I'd never been around so many uniformed military personnel in my life. It likes to think of itself as the sailing capital of the world. I've been told that at any time the city of Annapolis moors over 8,000 sailboats. It's got 2 very, very large sailboat shows. When you come over a bridge into where I live in an area called Eastport, the first thing you see is the Mercedes-Benz dealership. It is a town of wealth. It's the state capital. It's a colonial city since about 1630. It's the home of St. John's College. It's the county seat. I joke that it's a triangle with each leg being about 25 miles between Baltimore, Washington, and Annapolis, and I call that the bureaucratic Bermuda Triangle, into which if you fall, you will never return. And the thing about bureaucracies, and many of the folks that I serve are part of either the state or the national, the federal bureaucracy, a bureaucracy of some sort, is bureaucracies tend to lean into stasis. They do not like to change. My congregation, the congregation I serve, was no different. And so when I arrived there, one of the things I kept wondering about was how was I best going to lead, support, confront, challenge, and nurture these people into a multicultural future that they said they wanted, but were clearly resisting for decades. Another interesting thing about Annapolis is that the congregation has been there only since 1954, but if you go up and down the eastern seaboard from Savannah to Bangor, Maine, you have Unitarian churches that all kind of came around about the same time, but not Annapolis. Not Annapolis, and I've always wondered why. I've sometimes struggled in how best to express my hope, faith, and love as we walk into that vision. And that vision says that the Unitarian Universalist Church of Annapolis exists to create the beloved community by inspiring and empowering all souls to lead bold and compassionate lives. I often think that that could be the purpose of Unitarian Universalism. That Unitarian Universalism exists to create the beloved community by inspiring and empowering all souls to lead bold and compassionate lives. I recently was at a workshop and heard Phyllis Braxton. Do you know Phyllis Braxton of Pink Consulting? And I don't know if this was original to Phyllis, or she was quoting somebody else when she said that authenticity trumps perfection every time. Authenticity trumps perfection every time, or something close to that, she said. And this is a good characterization of how I would like to think on my best days I go about my ministry. And it names the kind of vulnerability I feel I must have and be present to in my ministry, which is what I want to talk with you about, is bringing that vulnerability into my ministry as a way of walking and partnering into a multicultural future. I will share with you a framework or a paradigm, a formula, if you will, a partner, some wisdom that has pushed and guided and supported me in living this authenticity and vulnerability that I feel is imperative to my ministry. And so I start with words that likelihood is everybody here is familiar with. They are from Hebrew Scripture. The setting is that the people of Israel are struggling, as they often are, trying to make sense of what it is they're supposed to be doing, how it is they are supposed to be in right relationship with their God. And they're asking, what does righteousness or pious living look like? And I will speak about a prophet. There are many kinds of prophets. The Old Testament prophet Micah, who says to them, what is required of you? And then I imagine Micah saying really to himself, give me a break. Why do you keep asking these questions? Here's what's expected. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Justice, mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And so here's a model of multicultural ministry that first is uncharacteristic of white male privilege. Justice, mercy, and humility are uncharacteristic of white male privilege. And I would go so far as to say, here is a model of ministry uncharacteristic of Unitarian Universalism, which has been shaped by North Atlantic European assumptions of privilege. So let me unpack Micah's bold and affirming and subversive prophetic trinity in reverse order, and let me share what Micah has meant for me. Walk humbly with your God. I start at the end of that trinity because for me, it's the most challenging part. Without this, the rest doesn't work. And it's not even the God part, which for me comes naturally if I can simply learn how to walk humbly with. You see, it's the humility piece that's the hardest. As a white male and as a Unitarian Universalist, being humble doesn't come easily. Actually, the cultural expectations as a white male UU minister is not to be humble. And here for me is an irony, because I was raised in my family of origin, I was taught humility. But as I left home, I learned humility was not rewarded or supported, and especially not in the Unitarian Universalist ministry. Now, that was 40 years ago, and maybe things have changed, but as I listen to people talk, as I listen to my colleagues in social settings, I'm not sure it's changed. So you see, there's this double whammy, and sometimes it's confusing. Walking humbly means I'm not expected to know the answer. I don't talk or preach or assume that I have an answer, that there are many answers, that there are answers that are larger than me, that I don't even know all the time what those answers look like. I can't even imagine what they are. And yet, being humble means naming those feelings, those thinkings, and doing it publicly, because someone once said it's only when you publicly name those that you show integrity. It's only then that you show integrity. And one of the ways that in Annapolis we have been doing that is we have a Tuesday evening worship called Awake. It's part of our Awake ministry, and it's a spirited worship. And we are going to be a featured program. This is my PR. This is Dana, and Dana's part of Awake Ministry. And she's going to pass these out. We are a featured program at GA this year, and I would like you to come. And one of the things that this has taught me is how to partner with a degree of openness that I've almost been led into by two other colleagues of mine that are on the staff at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Annapolis. And I would invite you, if you're going to be a General Assembly, to come and look at what this vulnerability and partnering can look like when it comes to worship. That one of the unique things that has happened in this partnership that we never had intended is that it also has become an interfaith partnership, largely because half of the band are Pentecostals. And one of the things that's happened here is that up until Awake worship started, Pentecostals would not have set foot inside of the Unitarian Universalist Church. All of these musicians had to get the permission of their minister to come and participate, and they have become some of our largest supporters and spokespeople now. And so this just isn't a UU movement anymore. It has become an interfaith movement, something that we were not prepared for and that we were surprised by. So walking humbly in part means learning how to partner, how to be open to the possibility, the celebration of partnership. It's also in that partnership that I learn how to walk with and not alone. I'm not a lone ranger. One of my favorite shows when I was a kid. I'm not a lone ranger, which was a Midwestern individualism that I was deeply schooled in. Walking with means sharing power. The power of worship, the power of leadership, all those things that come with white male privilege that sometimes I simply did not recognize, I took for granted. But once you begin to open yourself up with vulnerability, with authenticity to the possibility of something looking different, that you discover you can walk with someone. And I'll tell you what, that took a lot out of my backpack and freed me up in ways that I simply had never known. Finally, I'm walking. I'm not running. I'm not standing. I'm walking toward and with my truth, which for my ministry is the shaping of the beloved community. And more on that in a moment. Again, I'm walking backwards through Micah. So next is loving mercy. Micah says what's expected is not just to show mercy or practice mercy. He says we have to love mercy. Mercy me. Love mercy. In my ministry, mistakes have been made. Mistakes are still going to be made by me and by others. Mercy and forgiveness are essential to my ministry and are part of that humbleness. Or another way to think about it is that in doing the work of multiculturalism, there is a pastoral aspect. As we reimagine and restory ourselves as multicultural Unitarian Universalists, there will be anger, loss, grieving, and fear, as well as celebration, vitality, and excitement. In this potpourri of feelings, I've had to learn how to minister in this setting without being pulled apart or redirected from the vision, which has also meant learning how to take care of myself, something that I don't do well, which is another legacy of white male privilege. And we can talk about this because I think it's an aspect we don't talk about enough, is how to not allow ourselves to be pulled apart in the midst of all of those strong feelings. Finally, do justice. Doing justice with mercy and humbleness. Doing justice outreach is something that for most Unitarian Universalists, me too, seems to almost come naturally, and clearly it's part of our tradition, or at least we tell ourselves it's part of our tradition. Where my authenticity and vulnerability are challenging me is moving from justice outreach to justice inreach. I've committed my ministry to walking with my congregation as we become a model of the beloved community, the community that we seek. I am convinced that every congregation is a beloved community. And yet sometimes we don't demand of our own congregations. I didn't demand of my congregation the same set of characteristics that we demand of the world. In fact, sometimes it seemed to me that we were running away from those that we shared hymnals with to serve those outside of our building because we didn't know what to do with those people we sat next to. I look at our foundational documents, our worship, our governance, our faith development, our ministers, our staff, our right relations, and I ask, are we living the beloved community that we expect and demand in the larger world? Can you hold up the UUA's 7 principles and use that as a ruler against your own congregation and say, how are we living in our congregation the 7 principles? About 15 years ago, I answered, I'm not. This congregation is not. It seemed that the people I serve were more interested in challenging and changing the world than they were in challenging and changing themselves. They were clearly more interested in creating the beloved community at large than becoming the beloved community they sought. Let me just give you an example. Because we are in the state capitol, members of the church are very quick to run down to the General Assembly and offer testimony on a variety of issues as a UU voice and for themselves. I remember one time there was an environmental bill that was before one of the bodies at the General Assembly, and there was a person that got up to give testimony and identified herself as a Unitarian Universalist and talked about Unitarian Universalism and how the principles had shaped her view of being green and the environment and all these things. And there was somebody in the audience who evidently was listening and thought, wow, I've got to go to that church. So think of yourself, and if somebody outside of your congregation heard you or someone else from your congregation describing your church as multicultural and then showed up on a Sunday morning based on what they had heard you say, what would they find? Would they leave disappointed, affirmed? Would they ever come back? I've been very open and hence vulnerable with those I serve. I ask them, can we partner to walk into this vision, this new story of a future? Frankly, I have found this modeling of the beloved community of justice in reach to be the most challenging, vulnerable, and meaningful ministry in my nearly 40 years. It has meant deep listening. It has meant learning how to step aside, speaking my truth in the first person, and demonstrating a willingness to risk and lead. And so with humbled partnering, mercy and justice, I move with vulnerability and authenticity to serve my people and the faith I love. Thanks.
I think that needs a song. Do you? Think that needs a song? I bet you most of you know Keep on Moving Forward, Pat Humphries, Emma's Revolution. Do you know that song? Gonna keep on moving forward. Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. Thank you. You didn't think we were just going to talk, right? So I want to tell you a very quick story. Not just 2 days ago, but the Wednesday before, I was in a meeting at the Senate President's Office for the Connecticut Legislature, and we went in there talking about a criminal justice reform bill trying to reduce the size of drug-free zones. I won't get into what that means. Some of you may know what that means. But 2 days prior, I was in a strategy session, and our congregation is part of a coalition that's been working on this bill. And in that particular strategy session, I was the only person in the room who was not formally incarcerated, and the only white person in the room, although I'm certainly not the only white person in the coalition. And the leaders turned to me when we got to the piece of the conversation about who's going to be in the room with the Senate President, and they said, "Josh, we need one of your elder white women." And I knew who I could get. I actually had a choice of elder white women who could come to the Senate President and talk about the war on drugs. And we made it happen. And I tell you this story. By the way, the bill died yesterday. We're upset about that, but the struggle continues. I tell you this story because for me, that's one of those measures that in the greater Hartford community, my white suburban congregation is seen as reliable, is seen as accountable for racial justice and for social justice. That's very, very important to me. So how do we get there? That's what I want to talk about. When I got out of seminary, I felt that I was very, very well prepared to lead a white congregation in becoming an anti-racist, multicultural congregation. Part of that was because I had the extraordinary opportunity to train with Crossroads Anti-Racism, which was then, and I believe now, still one of the premier anti-racism training organizations in the nation. And I worked for the Unitarian Universalist Association doing anti-racism educating and organizing for 4 years. And I thought, oh, I can do this. And 11 years later, you come to my congregation on Sunday. Friends, this is not a historically white congregation. This is a currently white congregation, which I love dearly. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that we have to start with who we are. And we have to own the culture that we have first before we can stretch out. And that's been one of my messages. And one of the reasons it's important to start with who we are and not try to be something we're not. Because when you own who you are, that's when you can really start to see who's not there. Right? So the traditional question, I suspect you've heard this in your congregations. I definitely heard it in those early years, is, well, why aren't they here? And how do we get them to come be with us? Right? You've heard that? Okay, good. I suspected you had. How do we get them to come be with us? And back to Taquiena's point about changing the conversation or changing the story, one thing we've successfully done is change the question to what are the anti-racist multicultural tables we need to be at in the wider community, right? Whether or not they are going to come to us, what are the tables we need to be at? Who do we need to be in relationship with? So that's become a driving question for us, and it's one that I'm very comfortable with. We answer the question in two ways. First, and the original way we answered it is we need to be at the anti-racist social justice tables, the anti-racist multicultural faith-based community organizing tables, and those have included tables where we're organizing in Connecticut for universal health care prior to the ACA, tables where we're organizing for criminal justice reform, transgender civil rights, marriage equality, working on the educational achievement gap, and people from the church, in a way that they didn't when I first got there, will come to the rallies, they'll come to the lobby days, they'll come to the candlelight vigils, and that's important because that's where they meet people who are different from them. That's where they actually experience what it means to be in an anti-racist, multicultural community. The other place, the other table we need to be at, or we've tried to be at, and this is actually learning I get from Jackie Lewis and Middle Collegiate and from Taquiena, is the multicultural arts table. Right? So what are the people of color and multicultural arts organizations in the greater Hartford region where we can be partners? And a lot of those organizations don't expect suburban white churches to reach out and say, hey, how could we partner with you? They're not sure what to make of that. But we've been working that, and it's been working well, and it opens up avenues in the life of the congregation that we hadn't had before. It brings people into the city. It brings people to poetry readings. It brings people to concerts. It brings people to art openings. Now, in being at both of these tables, these social justice tables and these arts tables, what also tends to happen is suddenly leaders at those tables are preaching in our pulpit. Leaders at those tables are coming to teach classes. Leaders at those tables are coming to our parties and our game nights and our family events and our funerals. And suddenly, this historically, currently white congregation actually doesn't feel quite as white. It doesn't feel quite as monocultural. You come on any Sunday morning and you might say, it's a white congregation. But you stick with the church through the course of the week, and the reality, the cultural reality, is very different than what you might see on Sunday morning. And it has an impact on Sunday morning. It's slow going. The change does not happen overnight. But what really matters, this is what I've learned, is those relationships. That's what gives us that access to that anti-racist multicultural community that we haven't become yet, but we are clearly becoming. Thank you. Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you all for having me. One of the things I've loved about coming to this conference before and is that I've learned a lot about what it means, how to do this work as a white male, from John Janka as well as Gordon and others. So this is a great part of this conference for me, and it's an honor to be here. I want to talk about where my heart is breaking right now as leading my people into a multicultural future. It's that sometimes I want to turn my back on people when I know what's required is that I turn the other cheek. Who? One of them is John. I was his minister for 8 years when our church was a 99.99% white congregation. And we worked together in leadership. We worked on a lot of different projects. We had a lot of fun. We had a lot of affection for one another. He loved our church. John is white and he's straight. And 6 years ago, when we began to change one of our worship services to make room for the members of a predominantly African-American Pentecostal congregation that was starting to join us in worship, he did not understand, and what was harder for me was that he didn't even seem to want to understand. To him, having drums and spirited singing to God and people holding their hands in the air while we were in worship and talking back during the sermon was wrong. The only solution that he would entertain was for us to go back to the way things were. John left the church, and I was angry, and I was hurt. Betty has sung in our adult choir for 20 years. She also loves our church. And she's white and straight and married. But when we had our annual all-choirs Christmas concert a few years back, and our new, mostly African-American praise choir was started singing, she and a number of others in our adult choir started plugging their ears with looks of contempt on their face, or anger or upset on their face. And unfortunately, Betty and the others were in the front row in plain view of the praise choir members who were singing. Now, the praise choir members, as you can imagine, were angry, and they were hurt, and I was furious, and I was disappointed. And it turns out that the earplugging was due to the volume of the amplified music, which I believe really was hurting their ears. But they also admit, some of them, that they don't like this kind of music, so the looks of condescension also had the feeling of condescension behind them that was real. Now, there's this other group of folks in my congregation, and I want you to know, I love all these people dearly. This other group, they embraced the changes in our church wholeheartedly and quite immediately. They started attending the new style of worship, and had become infused with a lot of African-American Pentecostal church culture and music. And as this was happening, some of them also began to work on learning about whiteness and learning about privilege. But after a while, after a number of years, some of the theology in the music started to bother some of them. And even though the clapping of hands and the dancing and all the different things that we did in that service, the way our choir director encourages us to turn and talk to each other and hug each other, and all of those things was something that they loved. Once the theology of the music started to get to them, they wanted me to change the theology of the music so that they would feel comfortable coming to the service. Now, when I tried to explain that service is designed with that kind of music to meet the worshiping needs of our newer members, and that if we changed that music, it would no longer meet their needs, that seemed to feel like, to some of them, that I was choosing our newer members over them, or our older members. Now, this fits into one of the narratives that one sometimes hears right now in our church, that I care more about our newer members than I do about our older members, many of whom still feel at a very fundamental level that this is really their church. And to be honest, it would be very hard to fund our church without those members. So here's the thing that these good folks who I love are teaching me about doing this racial diversity work right now in my congregation. Or here's the thing about this particular group. They're among some of my key leaders who have helped us to live into this future, and from being a historically white congregation into having an intentional multicultural vision of who we're becoming. So when they began to push back, and when they began to advocate for more assimilation by the people of color within our congregation in order to make the longtime members feel more comfortable, and they started to question whether we were on the right track, I became mad at them. Although I came to realize later what I was really feeling was scared. If they are having this much resistance to the cultural changes happening in our church, and if they're questioning my leadership, and if they're not sure we can do this, then I wonder how I'm ever going to get the majority of our members who are not early adopters and deeply committed to this work ever to really get what we're trying to do. But I knew I couldn't turn my back on them. And here's what I'm learning about doing this work, that I have a lot of training now in being a white ally to people of color, in being a straight ally to LGBT folks, in being a male ally to women. And I now have some years of experience in trying and learning to do that. But I have no training in being a white ally to white people who are struggling with the very real, painful realities of waking up for the first time to how white supremacy and heterosexism and male supremacy have affected them and are affecting us all. So I'm finding that even among my most committed, progressive, most emotionally mature white people, what is required of them to do this work in terms of experiencing their own sense of guilt and fear and anger and sadness and the incredible awkwardness of having to function in new ways because they've gotten where they are because of they know how to function in the world and be successful in this world, but now that way of being isn't going to get them where they need to go. So I'm talking about white people who are very confident and very, very self-assured in the world and have been very successful in their lives and suddenly finding themselves failing at things like running a meeting and feeling out of place in places where they've always felt at home. And on top of all that is a sense that if they're having a hard time and feeling resistance, maybe they're going to be perceived as racist. And maybe deep down they're having some questions of, does this mean I am racist? And the guilt and the pain associated with white folks who are feeling like they're being deemed racist or feeling like they're racist is very paralyzing. And so I've had to look into my own heart and ask myself, why am I so generous and why am I so understanding about the pain and the struggles of people of color who I'm doing this work with? And why am I more like Dr. Phil or Simon Cowell when it comes to the white people in my congregation? I'm more likely to say things to them like, yeah, it sucks having to admit that you're entitled and you act entitled and superior. Well, get over it. Right? It sucks having to wake up to the realization that all of the ways that you've been raised to think that you are lucky and special and superior because you're white is really not true. And I realize it's a tough pill to swallow, but why don't we just swallow it and move on? But I'm realizing that even if that is how I'm feeling at times, as their minister, I'm not always in a position to say that. And it's often not the most helpful thing to say anyway. So one of the things that I'm realizing is that as a leader doing this work, I need a forum and forums to express my own frustrations and my own heartbreak and my own impatience at the pace of things so that these emotions don't come out in unhealthy ways in the congregation. And that's one of the things that Mosaic Makers has been a great asset to my ministry for. A second thing I realize is that I need sensitivity training for how to be a white ally to other white people who are struggling on this journey, because the only way that this is going to work in a community like Unitarian Universalism to get predominantly white congregations to become multicultural and transform in that direction is to help white folks or white identified people find their voices in this multicultural dialogue when their voice is no longer the dominant voice. In other words, as we work to ensure that white, straight, male voices are no longer the primary dominant voice in our churches and our culture, we need to stay attuned to the effects of those changes on white people so that we can minister to them or minister to each other. As white men in particular and white people in general begin to see that we need to step back to make room for other voices, we need to help learn where our real power and influence comes from when it no longer comes from unacknowledged privilege and unexamined cultural assumptions. And we have to find ways to talk about this side of the multicultural community dynamic in ways that's not derisive and demeaning of the real pain and the real struggles of people, white people who are doing this work. Now, I'm wrapping up, but I'm going to give a crude, but I think maybe effective analogy. I hope effective. On one level, it's sort of like if you can imagine a powerful, haughty king who's been deposed, and he's sitting on the side of the road crying into his cup about the loss of his supreme power and privilege and place. And the common people, rightfully having a hard time feeling a lot of compassion for the dear king. Now, to take this analogy to its conclusion, I'm waking up to the reality that a significant part of the ministry for Unitarian Universalist ministers is to minister to the deposed royalty in our midst. Even though it's not as sexy and it's not as rewarding as ministering to and with those who are marginalized. Yet we have to learn how to turn our cheeks and not our backs on them. Because, as the saying says, we've seen the enemy and it is us. By which I mean, those of us with white skin privilege, once we break out of the ghetto of white supremacy, cannot just shun those who are still living in that neighborhood. And we can't just pretend that we did not come from that neighborhood. And we need to be willing to go back to our roots and back to our families and back to our churches and help those who are still living there to find a new way. But that's hard. When you can be living downtown, to go back into the neighborhood where you grew up can be a challenge. And that's a challenge that I'm dealing with right now in my ministry. I want to conclude by saying that what's helped me to learn to turn the other cheek with some of these folks who I dearly love and sometimes feel mad at is that I realize my anger just polarizes the situation and pushes us apart. And what I'm learning is that underneath my anger and underneath my frustration is a real broken heart. And that when I allow myself to lead with that brokenness and that sadness, and to not just yell at them, but tell them how hurt I am by what's happening, it sort of creates a crack and an opening through which we can talk together and walk together, and gives me hope that we can stay on this path. Thank you.
Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back.
I just want to share a quick story in conclusion. I think part of the theme of what we're trying to weave here is a theme of vulnerability, and how sometimes for white leaders in multicultural congregations, vulnerability can be a real leadership asset. 2 years ago, my partner Chris and I adopted our son. Nico was born in Baltimore, and he is biracial. And when he grows up, I know that the world will see him, perceive him, as a young black man. 2 weeks after we brought Nico into our home, George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin in Florida. And like many parents of African American children, Chris and I had nightmares. One of the most disturbing of which, when something like this. I'm walking down the street late at night in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and it's dark, and a young black man is walking toward me, and he's wearing a hoodie. and I feel my pulse start to race, and I feel my anxiety start to rise, and in fear, I cross to the other side of the street, and I watch the young man watch me cross the street. And I watch him reach up with his hands to pull the hoodie away from his face. And though in the dream I never see his face, I know that he's my son. And I wake up in a cold sweat. That dream reminds me of something that I already know about myself, which is that I am acculturated into the same images and fears and prejudices against young black men that George Zimmerman was, right? I share some of that acculturation. And back in D.C., after Trayvon's death, a lot of people, I live near Howard University, a lot of Howard students were wearing hoodies that said, "I am Trayvon." I had to really admit in a real, that at some level, while everything in me wanted to claim that identity with Trayvon, that I am also George Zimmerman, right? And no one's walking around wearing a hoodie that says, "I am George Zimmerman," okay? So, well, yeah, right. Maybe they are, yeah. 2 years later, George Zimmerman was acquitted. And I was away from the congregation at the time, and my colleague, the Reverend Susan Moore, stepped up to ministry to our congregation in both a pastoral and a prophetic way to the congregation at that time. But I knew that I, as the white minister, also had to take leadership at that moment in our multiracial congregation. And so when I came back, I preached a sermon to my congregation in which I shared with my congregation that story that I just shared with you, the story of my dream. I almost called the sermon, "I am George Zimmerman." I thought that would be a little maybe too provocative. So, but that was the refrain of the sermon, right? What I was trying to model in that sermon was a way for white folks in the congregation to own the racism into which all of us are acculturated, in honest ways and in straightforward ways, but in ways that weren't sort of guilt-inducing or shame-inducing, because none of those feelings are really productive in the work of building multiracial and anti-racist community. They can be kind of paralyzing. But rather to model for folks in the congregation how we can both own that acculturation and also own our commitment to being allies in this work of building a multiracial and anti-racist community. And so I guess the lesson that I've learned as a white leader in a multiracial congregation is that by modeling confession and vulnerability, that we can move forward together in building the world that we dream about. Will you sing with us one more time? Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. Amen.
Can we thank our panelists one more time? We have 15 minutes, and I'm sure that there are questions. just before we get to questions, if you have a question, we ask that you speak into a mic because this is being recorded. And our goal is to be able to share the learning from this conference beyond this conference, that we really want to spread the learning around. And another point of transparency is that for those of you who don't know about the Mosaic, why we call this Mosaic, the Unitarian Universalist Association does a conference called Mosaic Makers, which is for leaders involved in multicultural ministry. In the past, it has been focused mainly on congregations doing intentional multicultural ministry, as in diversifying their congregations. We are expanding our concept of Mosaic ministry to congregations such as Josh's, who are expanding into the larger world and crossing those borders of identity in order to be in right relationship and create that beloved community. The second thing you should know is that this experiment that we're doing is part of our moving towards a more formal partnership with Middle Church's Leading Edge project, because how can we say that we should be in partnership and continue when this fantastic conference happens every year, providing us an opportunity to be in relationship with other faith communities? How can we only do our own thing and not take advantage of the wonderful opportunity that this conference affords us? So in the future, we will be building this gradually, but Mosaic Makers will also be moving into relationship with the Leading Edge, and also look for some interesting things to happen at the 2015 General Assembly. And finally, everyone is invited to a dinner that is happening at 6 o'clock downstairs. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. It is not just for Unitarian Universalists. We hope that you will join us for dinner after at 6 o'clock after our structured conversations.
My comment is for Reverend Marlin. Appreciate hearing your story and hearing that perspective. Have a similar experience that's happening. I'm a senior pastor of a fledgling church in St. Paul, Minnesota that has partnered with Unitarian Church, and came there in search of housing more so, and space was really kind of ostracized from surrounding black churches and things like that. Not that we have any rejection there, but just finding the corridors of love there. My experience being there has been one kind of similar to what you're talking about, where on my side, from the black privilege side, I've lived this dual lifestyle as well. They look at me as a light in the midst of darkness to this well-established church. And so in some respects, from my Christian standpoint, looked at as, oh, you're a turncoat, and here you are partnering with these white folks and are forsaken, so having to kind of do that song and dance. And so I just appreciate hearing it from your perspective, not only as a leader, but as a white man who is sensitive to just all of the complexities that are at the table. And it's important that your voice and the voice of all of you on the panel continues to be heard, not just in circles like this, but in circles across the United States, because if we don't start doing work like this, meaningful work, I don't care what denomination you're a part of, it's going to become antiquated. And so I want to applaud you all for just being bold enough to stand here and say something like you did and share your stories and your faith. So I appreciate you.
Hi. Oh, Taquiena, you answered part of my question, because I was wondering if this was just for UUs. And you answered that part. I appreciated everything I have heard. Reverend Marlin, I love what you said. I came to All Souls 4 years ago, My first Sunday, I said, I am a flaming Christian. Okay? And when my thing is, I don't know, and maybe you all can help me. I want to know, how do we move the multicultural part of our education in the UU Church away from just being race? Because one's faith is one's culture. And I have found that we have been very accepting of Buddhists, Muslims, Jewish people who come in the UU Church. But I have said often, I have just felt like the canary in the mine when I say I'm Christian. And I understand, because many, when I do new members orientation, many of our members I say they're refugees from the Christian church. And I understand when I hear their stories. And it has been, I would say our church is 80% white, about 20% people of color. And it has been from African American members that I've gotten the comment when I first get there, don't bring that Jesus here. You see. And because I remind them of where they fled from. You see. And as they've gotten to know me and trust me and see that my theology is progressive, it's been much better. But how do we teach this? How do we talk about this? And how do we move the conversation of multiculturalism from race to other areas?
One of the things that we're, thank you. You could be speaking from my congregation as well. You could be a member of All Souls in Tulsa saying that same thing, except for with the difference of you had African Americans coming to you saying, don't bring Jesus here. We don't have that. Most of the African Americans who are in our congregation are embrace Christianity. But one of the things that we have done, we're doing right now, is something we got the idea from you all is in DC, we're doing a demographic survey of our congregation right now. And on that survey, we're asking so many different questions about diversity that it's really clear to anybody who takes it that when we're talking about culture change, we're not just talking about race. But one of the things that's significant around the theological piece is we have in there Trinitarian, we have atheists, Buddhists, all that stuff, and we have Trinitarian Universalist as an option, as well as Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Christian. And I have a strong feeling that we're going to have a lot. When I say a lot, we have a couple of thousand members. We're not going to have hundreds, but we're going to have probably 100 or so, I could imagine, that are Trinitarian Universalist. And some of our folks aren't sure what to do with the fact that we have Trinitarians in a Unitarian church. But just having it on the survey is an intervention in and of itself.
One of the things that has been nice, and there's some downsides to this too, but one of the things that's been nice about being in one congregation for 30 years is being able to sow the seeds of that kind of diversity and water them, watch some of it die, but see some of it sprout. And where I'm going with all that is, I think you have to name this as an issue and paint it in a larger picture of diversity. Annapolis is now blessed to have 3 ministers and an intern. We all use Christian metaphor. We all use Christian scripture. We all use, and we do it in a positive way. Let me tell you, maybe it's not as prevalent as it used to be that you would hear ministers from the pulpit make sarcastic remarks about Christianity and put downs, and we just don't do that. And I say I don't do that, and I don't appreciate it when I hear members of the congregation do that. So I think it has to be named, and it has to be named over and over for maybe a generation of Unitarian Universalists before you're going to actually see some change, because it's almost the same thing as becoming multicultural. This is not a 3 to 5 year project. We're talking 50 years, 100 years before we begin to see it. And I think also another thing is that when someone makes a comment like, well, as we all know, everybody here is really a humanist, you need to go and have a conversation with that person later and say, "You really believe that?" Because that's not true, and how many people are being put off who are new to Unitarian Universalism when they hear that kind of a comment. So.
Just another comment. I really like what you said, Reverend Susan. And, I think that we've got to start talking about liberation theology. And I know that comes from Christianity, but there's a lot of liberation theology. I am excited to see there'll be some historical Jesus talk going on here. But, I think a lot of the anti-racism, multicultural conversation, it comes out of the academy. And our work is to really center this in faith and get a little, thicker and deeper on that. So I just wanted to say I'm really glad for the question, and I think that's where you're going when you talk about vulnerability and authenticity and walking humbly with our God. And that just, to me, is the conversation that has to happen right now.
Boy, fantastic. Amen. Up until there used to be a time when, and Gary Dorian up at my alma mater at Union writes a lot about this in his trilogy on liberal Protestantism, that it wasn't until really the turn of the century, the last century, that the academy took over theology. Prior to that, theology came out of the church. It came out of the pulpit. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be creating theology. It's not you don't change the world by, the academicians preaching the right material. We change the world by transforming lives, and that's the purpose of congregations. And so if there's any place that liberation theology is supposed to be coming from, it's out of the congregational setting. And I think a question we have to ask as Unitarian Universalists is, who's doing that theology making today? Where's it coming from?
So I'm one of those humanists who struggles in this space a bit, because to me it's about navigating the teachings of Jesus and believing that Jesus is the Savior. And so, for example, if I'm singing a song and that's the core of the song is Jesus as Savior, if I'm going to be authentic and live the authentic spiritual life I intend to, I have a hard time going there. So it's something that I'm realizing that I struggle with every time I'm really in community with Christians. But that's my spiritual work to do. That's what it means. But this is where, and I so appreciate your comments in this space, because I see that that's where I'm going to struggle. I can see that ahead. But again, I think navigating that path is one that I look to ministers and, my fellow members of the church to help me through.
Yeah, I just want to say we're doing something in Tulsa that's a little bit scary and risky in a certain way. We've started we have 3 services on Sunday morning that have 3 different theological and liturgical styles, so that we have a humanist service that you could go to in our church and never hear about God or the Bible, and you could come to our 3rd service and it would be based in God and the Bible, theistic and Christian. And so what we're trying to do is all those people, from humanist to deep theists, all believe in the vision we have for the world and the justice work that we're doing in the world, and we want to make an on-ramp for all of them to be a part of that vision and that mission. And so we recognize that one size in worship doesn't fit all of our people, and that we would have to compromise the diversity and the strength of our community if we were to try to fit everybody into one worship service every Sunday. And so where our congregation comes together across those theological lines are in the justice-making work that we do in the schools, building homes, and all kinds of things that we do in the community, plus the fun events and all the activities and the things we do with our families and kids, so that what happens is the humanists are spending time with the Trinitarian Universalists in our church, but they don't have to worship together. They don't have to sing the same songs, except on certain big ordinations or big events like that. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. We're in jeopardy of balkanizing our church around theology, and we'll see where it all leads us. But the hope of it and the possibility that it holds for us is that we can pioneer some new forms of worship and bring in new people that we haven't reached for a long, long time who do believe in the core of what we're about, the mission of what we're about, and the vision of the world we're trying to create, but who, if we weren't doing worship differently, they wouldn't be involved at all.
And this is the last question.
Okay. Thanks. I'm Jess Helper, and I live in Washington, D.C. and work for the Unitarian Universalist Association. My question is not well-formed, I think, but it's around generational issues. And when Reverend Susan was talking about being a Christian and being a Christian refugee, I feel like a lot of, and it doesn't necessarily mean in my generation, but people who were raised in the Unitarian Universalist Church don't have the same kind of refugee experience. And likewise, I think folks in my generation have grew up with a different sort of, and have a different take about race and gender and sexual orientation than other folks. And so I'm wondering if you guys could comment on the growing edges or the contributions of younger folks and or things in that general field.
Thanks, Jess. That's a real issue at All Souls, which is a church that first became multiracial in the context of the civil rights movement, which was a particular era and a particular time and a particular way of thinking about what multiracial meant biracial. It meant black folks and white folks. And now younger folks coming into our congregation are multiracial, are more diverse than simply black and white, and we're growing into that, and so expanding the definition of what we mean by multiracial even has been an issue, and how we form community, how we form multiracial community when that civil rights movement was such a defining moment for interracial cooperation, and we're in a different moment now. How do we build that community now? So it doesn't fully answer your question, I know, Jess, but it's certainly, I spent a lot of time thinking about it at All Souls.
One quick observation and something that hasn't come up, I don't think, yet today, and that part of the multiculturalism that in Annapolis that we've realized is really, really critical is multi-generational. And just as much as a change in style of worship has been multi-generational worship, which many adults see as a time, especially older adults, as a Sunday not to come when we're doing multi-generational worship. And multi-generational worship is not my thing. I mean, it's really hard. I would write a sermon any day, any time, rather than lead multi-generational worship. Luckily, I've got a whole bunch of other folks, including Dana, when she was with us, who are really, really good at it. So it's kind of like, for me, it's often the elephant in the room when it comes to multicultural work, and that is multi-generational. The other thing that we really didn't have an opportunity to go into is kind of some of the history behind the 4 congregations we served. Rob has already said, All Souls became multicultural during civil rights. And so, it's I think everybody recognizes All Souls DC as being one of our leading multicultural congregations. Tulsa, 95, 6 years, they had another, largely people of color, dropped on them congregation. And my congregation is finally beginning to, get ahead of that edge, and it's becoming more multicultural. And Josh is, a congregation that's still learning what white means. And so we have for congregations that are kind of at very different stages, and yet the different themes, especially around vulnerability and authenticity in ministry, and how you model, for your congregation and others how to do this work is really a common theme and the common intersection, regardless of what our history is.
Thank you all for your participation. Jackie, did you have something for structured conversation, or were you leaving? Okay. Janice, should we do the questions now, or do you think it would work over the dinner table better? Okay. All right, so here's a question we actually presented to the panel that we think would be a good reflection question, whatever stage you're at with this ministry, and whatever role you have, whether you are a religious professional or you're a lay leader. But we understand this work happens in different contexts. It doesn't look the same in the East Village as it looks in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Annapolis, Maryland, or in Manchester, Washington, D.C. It doesn't look the same in San Diego, where Janice Marie Johnson and I were just at. Doesn't look the same in St. Paul, wherever you are. To think about what is the dominant narrative, and you can insert the word you want, but more and more I'm looking at the fact that our failure to talk about race is leading to more racism. It's just happening. But what's the dominant narrative in your community about race? And how are you, whether as a leader or a congregation or an individual, how are you countering, challenging that narrative through what you do? Because we all have, one of the dominant narratives, we're post-racial. Really? I don't think so. But Judge John Roberts thinks so. All right? So to think about what's the dominant narrative in your context. Is it about immigration? Is it about mass incarceration? Is it about schools? What is that narrative in your context? And how are you working to counter that narrative? So that's the question, in 3s, in 4s, and over dinner downstairs, 6 o'clock. Please join us there. Thank you, Jackie.